When an innocent black teenager is unjustly arrested by a corrupt police officer over a petty accusation, it exposes a disturbing pattern of racial targeting and systemic corruption. The officer, driven by prejudice and greed, exploits his authority to funnel vulnerable kids into a for-profit detention system, destroying lives for personal gain. Enter Nathaniel Calloway, a relentless black lawyer who refuses to let the injustice stand. As he uncovers shocking truths about the officer's abuse of power and the town's complicity, the fight for justice becomes a high-stakes battle against deep-rooted racism and corruption. It was a quiet morning in the small town of Willowbrook, the kind of morning where birds chirped lazily from their perches, and the soft hum of lawnmowers filled the air. 12-year-old Michael Anderson sat on the front steps of his house, his basketball resting beside him. He was waiting for his best friend, Jaden, to come over so they could head to the park and shoot hoops. Michael's father, James, watched him from the kitchen window as he poured himself another cup of coffee. A soft smile crossed his face. Mornings like this always reminded him of how quickly Michael was growing up. He looked down at the newspaper in his hand, headlines about local politics barely registering, as he thought about taking Michael for ice cream later. Outside, Michael had begun to dribble the ball on the sidewalk, each bounce echoing against the pavement. He counted each one softly under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, until the sound of tires pulling up made him pause. A police car had stopped in front of their house. The engine idled loudly as the door opened, and out stepped Officer Hayes, a figure Michael had seen a few times before, but never up close. Hayes was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried the kind of stare that made people look away. Michael frowned slightly, unsure why a police officer would stop here. He let the basketball settle against his hip, watching as Hayes strode toward him. "Hey, kid," Hayes called, his voice sharp and carrying across the yard. Michael blinked, pointing to himself. "Me?" "Yes, you," Hayes replied, stopping a few feet away. His gaze dropped to the basketball, and then to Michael's face. "What are you doing out here?" Michael hesitated, suddenly uneasy. Just, waiting for my friend," he said softly. "We were going to play basketball." Hayes's eyes narrowed, his hand resting casually near the radio clipped to his vest. "This your house?" Michael nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. My dad's inside." For a moment, Hayes didn't say anything. His eyes scanned the yard, then landed on the small chalk markings along the driveway where Michael and Jaden had been drawing with Michael's little sister the day before. Silly shapes, stars, and their initials inside a big heart. "Who did all that?" Hayes asked, pointing with his chin. Michael followed his gaze, his confusion growing. "Oh, we did yesterday. It's just chalk my sister likes to draw." "You're defacing property," Hayes interrupted, his voice cold. "You can't just go around marking up whatever you want, that's vandalism." Michael's mouth fell open slightly. "It's not. It washes off," he stammered. "It's just chalk." "Don't talk back," Hayes snapped, his tone hardening. "You got ID on you?" Michael's brow furrowed. "I'm 12, he said, his voice small now. Hayes didn't seem to care. "Step over here," he ordered, jerking his head toward the squad car. Michael froze, his heart pounding as a chill crept over him. "I didn't do anything wrong," he whispered. Inside the house, James had noticed the police car and the growing tension outside. He set his coffee cup down, his pulse quickening as he stepped toward the front door. Something wasn't right. The small-town courthouse of Millbrook was a blend of old-world charm and modern necessity, its whitewashed columns standing resolute against the backdrop of a cloudless morning sky. The scent of freshly mowed grass lingered in the air, mingling with the faint hum of distant traffic. Inside, the echo of hurried footsteps and quiet conversations filled the space, where townsfolk moved about, either out of duty or curiosity. Nathaniel Calloway adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit as he stood near the courthouse steps, his gaze sweeping over the bustling street. To anyone passing by, he might have seemed like a visiting attorney or a businessman with a matter of local interest. But Nathaniel was far more than that. He was a nationally recognized civil rights lawyer, a man whose name carried weight in circles of power, and a recent transplant to Millbrook, where he had opened a modest law firm to advocate for the underrepresented. He had made a name for himself not with flash or bravado, but with diligence and an unshakable belief in justice. Yet here in Millbrook, a town steeped in unspoken hierarchies and old prejudices, his success often seemed to evaporate in the eyes of those who didn't know his name, or chose to ignore it. Nathaniel pulled out his phone, scrolling through the emails that had piled up since his morning coffee. He had learned to compartmentalize, to juggle the intensity of his career with his personal life, though the latter often came in second place. He was meeting a young client today, a high school senior accused of shoplifting, though the evidence against him was flimsy at best. The courthouse clerk had promised to pull the files, and Nathaniel was here early to ensure nothing was overlooked. "Excuse me, sir, you can't park there." The voice cut through his thoughts. Nathaniel turned to see a uniformed parking officer, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and mirrored sunglasses, gesturing toward the black luxury sedan parked neatly in front of the courthouse. Nathaniel frowned slightly. "It's a reserved spot," Nathaniel replied evenly, his tone polite but firm. "For courthouse personnel." The officer pushed his sunglasses higher, giving Nathaniel a once-over that lingered just long enough to feel uncomfortable. "And your courthouse personnel?" Nathaniel paused, his lips tightening. "Yes. I'm an attorney," he said after a moment, keeping his voice measured. "I have clearance for that space." The officer smirked, clearly unconvinced. "Don't see your badge displayed." Nathaniel's jaw flexed, but he reminded himself to keep calm. He reached into his pocket, producing a laminated card with his credentials, which he held out toward the officer. The man barely glanced at it before shrugging. "All right," he muttered, turning away with an air of reluctance. "Just following protocol." Nathaniel exhaled slowly, shaking his head as he tucked the card back into his pocket. Moments like this weren't new, but they never stopped being exhausting. A reminder that respect in some places wasn't earned by merit, but by skin color and the weight of systemic bias. He stepped inside the courthouse. The cool air conditioning, a welcome reprieve from the rising heat outside the clerk's desk, was to his left, where a young woman with auburn hair and a bright smile greeted him. "Good morning, Mr. Calloway. I have the Daniels file you requested," she said, handing him a slim manila folder. "Thank you, Emily," Nathaniel replied, his voice warm. "How's your son doing? Did he end up making the soccer team?" Emily beamed. "He did. He's so excited. Thank you again for your advice. It really helped." Nathaniel waved her gratitude away. "Just doing my part," he said with a smile, before turning to find a seat in the lobby. As he flipped through the file, he could feel the occasional glance in his direction. It wasn't unusual. People often looked, sometimes out of recognition, sometimes with curiosity. Today, though, it felt different, sharper, as if the weight of unspoken judgment lingered in the air. He caught a snippet of hushed conversation nearby. Two older men in worn flannel shirts sitting by the water fountain. "Isn't he that new guy?" one muttered. "Yeah, Calloway or something," the other replied. "Came here from the city. Don't know why he'd bother with a place like this." Nathaniel let the words roll off him. He had chosen Millbrook because it was a place that needed people like him. Someone who wouldn't shy away from the hard cases, who would speak for those the system overlooked. Still, the skepticism he faced wasn't easy to ignore. His thoughts were interrupted by the click of heels on the polished floor. He looked up to see a familiar face. District Attorney Margaret Albright. She was a formidable figure in Millbrook, known for her sharp intellect and unrelenting drive. She gave Nathaniel a curt nod as she passed, her expression neutral but her eyes calculating. "Calloway," she said in acknowledgement. Her tone clipped. "Albright," Nathaniel replied, matching her coolness with a polite nod. They had clashed in court several times already, and while their professional exchanges were always respectful, there was an unspoken tension between them. Nathaniel suspected it wasn't just because they were often on opposite sides of the courtroom. There was something about his presence in Millbrook that seemed to unsettle people like Margaret, though she would never admit it. Nathaniel returned to the file, his focus sharpening as he reviewed the details. The case was straightforward enough. His client, Jeremy Daniels, had been accused of slipping a candy bar into his pocket at a gas station. The store's surveillance footage, however, was inconclusive, and Jeremy insisted he had placed the candy bar back on the shelf. Nathaniel was confident he could get the charges dismissed, But he also knew that cases like this were rarely about the facts alone. They were about perceptions, biases, and assumptions, forces he had spent his entire career fighting against. As he closed the folder, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from his assistant, Maria. "Calloway, just a heads up. I overheard something about Officer Daniels this morning. Apparently, he's the arresting officer on the Daniels case. Be careful. Word is, he doesn't like you much." Nathaniel frowned, his mind racing. Officer Daniels was a name he had heard before, a figure with a reputation for being heavy-handed and unyielding. Their paths hadn't crossed directly, but Nathaniel had seen the effects of Daniels' actions in the cases he took on. The idea that Daniels had targeted Jeremy didn't sit right with him. It felt deliberate. He typed back a quick response. "Thanks for the warning, I'll keep an eye out." As he slipped his phone back into his pocket, Nathaniel's resolve hardened. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them head-on. That was why he had come to Millbrook, not to be accepted, but to make a difference. And today, that fight began anew. Nathaniel Calloway stepped into the small courtroom, his polished shoes clicking softly on the worn tile floor. The room was typical for Millbrook, simple and utilitarian, its wood-paneled walls decorated with faded state seals and portraits of long-gone judges. Sunlight slanted through tall, dust-speckled windows, casting soft shadows across the benches. In the front row sat Jeremy Daniels, his wiry frame slouched forward, shoulders tense. At 17, Jeremy was all sharp edges, thin arms, oversized sneakers, and wary eyes that darted toward the door every few seconds. His mother, a petite woman in her 40s, sat beside him, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Nathaniel gave them a brief nod as he approached. Jeremy's mother managed a small, grateful smile. "Morning, Miss Daniels," Nathaniel said quietly, crouching to meet her eye level. "We'll get through this, trust me." "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," she whispered, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "I just want this nightmare over." Nathaniel straightened, his focus now shifting toward the judge's bench. Behind it sat Judge Garrison, a man with a bald head and permanent scowl etched into his sagging face. He adjusted his robe as he shuffled paperwork, glancing toward Nathaniel with little interest. At the far table, seated with perfect indifference, was Officer Daniels, broad and thick-necked. The man exuded authority, his uniform ironed to crisp perfection. He watched Nathaniel with narrowed eyes, his lips curled into the faintest smirk, a look that Nathaniel knew all too well. It was a look that said, "I'm in control here." Nathaniel made his way to the defense table and set down his briefcase, feeling Officer Daniels's gaze burning into him. He glanced over once, meeting the man's eyes, but Daniels didn't look away. Instead, he gave a small, mocking shake of his head. Nathaniel ignored him, focusing instead on the files spread in front of him. Every detail mattered, and today wasn't the day to lose focus. "Court is now in session," the bailiff intoned, his voice booming through the otherwise quiet room. "Judge Garrison presiding." The judge adjusted his glasses and peered down at Nathaniel. "Mr. Calloway," he drawled, sounding already inconvenienced. "You're representing Mr. Daniels in the matter of shoplifting?" "Yes, Your Honor," Nathaniel said, rising to his full height, his tone calm and measured. Judge Garrison's gaze flickered toward Jeremy, then back to Nathaniel. "Well, let's get to it, Officer Daniels. Please state the details of the incident." Nathaniel sat down as Officer Daniels stood, his uniform straining against his broad chest. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if relishing the attention. "On the afternoon of April 21st, Daniels began, his voice low and steady. "I responded to a call from the Millbrook Gas Mart about a suspected shoplifter. The store clerk reported that the individual," he jerked his chin toward Jeremy, "had been seen putting merchandise in his pocket before attempting to leave the store." "That's not true," Jeremy muttered under his breath. Nathaniel put a calming hand on the boy's arm, signaling him to stay quiet. "Continue," Judge Garrison said, clearly uninterested in interruptions. "I arrived on the scene," Daniels continued, "and questioned the suspect. At that time, I found a candy bar in his possession. He was unable to provide a receipt." Daniels paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Given the circumstances, I placed him under arrest." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Circumstances, he thought bitterly. What Daniels left out was how Jeremy had immediately explained that he put the candy bar back on the shelf, something Nathaniel knew the footage would support. But Daniels had heard what he wanted to hear, seen what he wanted to see. "Thank you, officer," Judge Garrison said blandly. "Mr. Calloway, your response?" Nathaniel stood and smoothed his tie, his voice carrying across the silent room with practiced ease. "Your Honor, the facts in this case are flimsy at best. The surveillance footage clearly shows Jeremy placing the candy bar back on the shelf." Judge Garrison squinted down at him. "You have this footage?" "Yes, Your Honor. I've submitted it to the court as Exhibit A." The judge looked mildly annoyed at the effort this would take. "Fine, let's review it." The bailiff set up the grainy footage on the monitor. The black and white video played, showing Jeremy walking to the candy display, picking up the bar, examining it, and then, just as Nathaniel had said, putting it back down. Nathaniel glanced over at Officer Daniels, whose face had tightened ever so slightly, his smirk disappearing. But there was no apology in his eyes, only disdain. As the video ended, Nathaniel turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this clearly contradicts the arresting officer's testimony. Jeremy Daniels did not attempt to leave the store with unpaid merchandise. He was wrongfully accused." Judge Garrison scratched his head, looking vaguely annoyed by the clarity of the evidence. "Officer Daniels?" Daniels' voice was sharp as he stood again. "The video doesn't show everything. The suspect was behaving suspiciously. I had reason to believe he intended to steal the item." "Intended?" Nathaniel echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Your Honor, intent without action isn't grounds for arrest. Jeremy Daniels returned the item to the shelf. That's not theft." Daniels' eyes flashed as he cut in. "With all due respect, sir, I was doing my job." The word "sir" carried a sneer that everyone in the room heard. Nathaniel's grip on his pen tightened. He knew what Daniels was doing, asserting his authority, challenging Nathaniel's presence in this room. This wasn't about Jeremy anymore, it was about power, and the fact that men like Daniels didn't like being challenged by men like Nathaniel. Nathaniel didn't take the bait. "And your job, Officer Daniels, includes arresting teenagers for crimes they didn't commit." "Order!" Judge Garrison barked, though his voice lacked any real force. He leaned back in his chair, clearly tired of the back and forth. "Mr. Calloway, do you have any further statements?" Nathaniel nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm requesting that these charges be dismissed immediately. Jeremy Daniels did nothing wrong. He's a high school senior with no prior record, and this case should not be wasting the court's time." Judge Garrison let out a sigh and rubbed his temples. He looked over at Officer Daniels, then at Jeremy. "I'll review the evidence further," he said. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning." Nathaniel's shoulders stiffened. Tomorrow, there was no reason to drag this out. He opened his mouth to protest, but stopped himself, biting back his frustration. "Yes, Your Honor," he said instead, his voice steady. The judge banged his gavel, and the room slowly began to clear. Officer Daniels lingered near the door, his smirk returning as he watched Nathaniel pack up his briefcase. "Pretty quick to defend shoplifters, huh?" Daniels said under his breath, his tone smug. Nathaniel paused, looking up at him, calm and unblinking. "You don't get to decide who's guilty, Daniels. The law does." Daniels chuckled darkly, stepping closer. "We'll see about that." Nathaniel said nothing. He held the officer's gaze, unwavering, until Daniels finally turned and walked away. As Nathaniel walked Jeremy and his mother out of the courthouse, the afternoon sun felt heavier than before. Its heat pressing down on his shoulders, Ms. Daniels let out a shaky breath. "I don't understand," she said softly. "We proved he didn't do it. Why didn't the judge just dismiss it?" Nathaniel looked at her, his voice gentle but honest. "Because sometimes, people like Jeremy aren't given the benefit of the doubt." Jeremy looked up, his face shadowed with anger and confusion. "I didn't do anything wrong. Why does he hate me?" Nathaniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because some people see what they want to see, but we'll fight this, Jeremy, and we'll win." As they walked to the parking lot, Nathaniel felt the weight of the day settling deep in his chest. This wasn't just a case, it was a reflection of the system, one he had been fighting against his entire life. And it was far from over. Nathaniel Calloway stepped into his office later that afternoon, his frustration simmering, just beneath the surface. The meeting with Judge Garrison had been a blatant stall, and Officer Daniels' smugness lingered like an unpleasant aftertaste. He set his briefcase down and loosened his tie, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. His assistant, Maria, popped her head into the doorway. "You doing okay, Mr. Calloway?" Nathaniel offered a tight smile. "I'm fine. How did the afternoon calls go?" Maria hesitated, shifting her weight. "There's something you need to know." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Maria stepped inside, clutching a folder. "I spoke with a reporter earlier, Mitchell Ford from the Millbrook Times. He said he's been digging into some of Officer Daniels' cases. There's a pattern." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "What kind of pattern?" Maria handed him the folder, her expression grim. "Daniels has arrested more than a dozen black teenagers in the past year for minor offenses. A lot of the cases fell apart, just like Jeremy's, but the charges were enough to leave marks on their records." Nathaniel flipped through the papers. Each case was a gut punch. Petty theft, disorderly conduct, even jaywalking kids who hadn't stood a chance. His fingers tightened around the folder as his anger rose like a slow-building storm. "Where's Mitchell now?" Nathaniel asked, his voice quiet but firm. "He wants to meet you. Said he's got more information, something big, but he's worried about stirring up trouble without backup." Nathaniel nodded, already grabbing his coat. "Tell him I'll meet him in an hour. Set it up." Nathaniel arrived at the Depot, a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town, its cracked neon sign buzzing faintly in the twilight. It was the kind of place where secrets were shared in hushed tones over cups of weak coffee. Nathaniel scanned the booths until he spotted Mitchell Ford hunched over a table in the back, a stack of papers in front of him. Mitchell was a wiry man in his 40s, with tired eyes and an old leather jacket that had seen better days. He looked up as Nathaniel approached, gesturing for him to sit. "Calloway," Mitchell said, his voice low. "Glad you came." Nathaniel slid into the booth. "You said you had something. What's going on, Mitchell?" Mitchell looked around nervously before leaning in. "It's bigger than Daniels," he whispered. "I've been digging through arrest reports, court records, all of it. Daniels isn't just targeting kids, he's feeding them into something else." Nathaniel frowned. "Feeding them? What are you talking about?" Mitchell pulled a few documents from his stack and laid them out. "Look at this," he said, tapping the page. "Half the kids Daniels arrested ended up in a private juvenile detention center outside of town, Brookhaven Youth Facility. It's run by a private contractor, and guess who gets kickbacks for every kid that lands there?" Nathaniel's stomach turned as he scanned the paperwork. There it was in black and white. Financial records linking Officer Daniels and a handful of other officials to Brookhaven. Each arrest meant profit. "This is a pipeline," Nathaniel said, his voice low and cold. "They're exploiting these kids for money." Mitchell nodded grimly. "It's not just Daniels, either, the gas station clerk in Jeremy's case. He's been filing bogus complaints for months. Daniels swoops in, makes an arrest, and it's a payday for the whole system." Nathaniel clenched his fists, a fire building inside him. "And Judge Garrison?" Mitchell hesitated. "There's no hard proof on him yet, but his dismissal rate on these cases is abysmally low. He's letting the pipeline run unchecked." Nathaniel leaned back, his mind racing. The injustice was staggering, and it went far deeper than he had imagined. Jeremy was just one name on a growing list of victims. How many families have they destroyed? "What do you want to do with this, Calloway?" Mitchell asked, watching him carefully. "I can run the story, but I'll need a public voice, someone like you, to back it up. If we don't act fast, they'll bury this." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "We go public, but first, I need to make sure Jeremy is safe." As Nathaniel stepped out of the diner, the night air hit him like a slap. He fumbled for his keys, his mind still spinning with everything he'd learned. He didn't notice the squad car until it pulled up beside him, its headlights flaring like angry eyes. "Mr. Calloway." The voice was unmistakable. Nathaniel turned slowly, his shoulders squaring as Officer Daniels stepped out of the car, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Daniels," Nathaniel replied, his tone cool. Daniels smirked as he closed the distance, his boots crunching against the gravel. "What brings you to this part of town, Calloway? Meeting someone plotting something?" Nathaniel said nothing. He could feel the tension rising between them, the unspoken threat in Daniels' every move. Funny thing, Daniels continued, circling Nathaniel like a predator. A couple of my guys say you've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Talking to reporters, digging through records, makes me wonder what you're up to. I'm doing my job, Nathaniel said firmly, holding his ground. Something you should try sometime. Daniel's face darkened, his smirk disappearing. Watch yourself, Calloway, he hissed, stepping closer, his voice low and venomous. You might think you're smarter than the rest of us, but you're not untouchable. Nathaniel felt his blood boil, but he refused to rise to the bait. Are you threatening me, Officer Daniels? Daniels' lips curled into a sneer. Take it however you want. He stepped back, his hand tapping the hood of Nathaniel's car. Drive safe tonight. Nathaniel didn't move until Daniel's squad car disappeared into the darkness. His chest rose and fell as he fought to steady himself, his heart pounding with anger. Nathaniel barely slept that night. His thoughts were consumed by Jeremy, the pipeline, and the realization that Daniels, and likely others, were watching him. By morning, Maria called him with news that made his blood run cold. Jeremy's been picked up again, she said, her voice shaky. They're saying it's for resisting arrest, but I don't buy it. Nathaniel grabbed his keys and was out the door in minutes, his pulse pounding in his ears. They're trying to make Jeremy disappear, he thought. Not on my watch. When Nathaniel arrived at the police station, the tension in the air was palpable. He marched straight to the front desk, his voice sharp. I want to see Jeremy Daniels now. The officer behind the desk, a young man with nervous eyes, stammered. Mr. Calloway, I'm not sure. Now, Nathaniel snapped. Before the officer could respond, Officer Daniels appeared from the back, his smirk firmly in place. Looking for someone, Calloway? Where is he? Nathaniel demanded, his voice cold and unrelenting. Daniels crossed his arms, feigning innocence. Jeremy. Oh, we've got him in the back. He decided to get mouthy with another officer, so we brought him in. You know, for his own good. Nathaniel stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. You're not going to get away with this. Daniels shrugged. You think anyone's going to believe you, a hotshot lawyer crying foul? Good luck with that. Nathaniel's chest burned with fury, but his voice remained calm. I've got all the evidence I need, Daniels, the pipeline, the kickbacks, the fake arrests. You can't bury it. Daniels's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he recovered quickly. Then I guess you better watch your back. Nathaniel held his gaze, unflinching. And you better start packing your bags, Daniels, because when this is over, you're done. Nathaniel walked out of the police station with fire in his veins. Daniels had made this personal, and now Jeremy's life, and countless others, hung in the balance. There was no turning back. He dialed Mitchell Ford. Run the story, he said, his voice sharp with resolve. I'll hold the press conference tomorrow. They're going to hear the truth. Nathaniel hung up, his jaw set, his mind racing. The fight was far from over, but one thing was certain. He was ready. Nathaniel Calloway arrived at the press conference with a purpose. A small crowd had already gathered at the steps of the Millbrook Town Hall, concerned citizens, curious reporters, and a few familiar faces from the local police department, including Officer Daniels. His presence was like gasoline waiting for a spark. Nathaniel adjusted his tie as he stepped up to the podium. Mitchell Ford stood off to the side, clutching his notepad with a look that balanced anticipation and unease. Maria had been working the phones all morning to get local outlets here, and it had paid off. The Millbrook Times, 2 radio stations, and even a regional news crew were setting up their equipment. This was the moment. Nathaniel looked out over the crowd, his deep voice carrying as he began. Good afternoon. My name is Nathaniel Calloway. I'm a lawyer, a resident of this community, and someone who believes that justice belongs to everyone, not just those it chooses to favor. The murmurs stilled, the weight of his words drawing their attention. Today, I stand here to shed light on a system that has been operating unchecked in Millbrook. Over the last year, dozens of black teenagers, children, have been arrested under questionable circumstances. Petty accusations, fabricated charges, and arrests that often lead to nothing more than fingerprints on file and futures put at risk. Camera flashes began to pop. A woman near the front, Jeremy's mother, clutched her purse to her chest, her expression both hopeful and terrified. More troubling, we have uncovered financial ties between Officer Greg Daniels and Brookhaven Youth Facility, a private detention center profiting from every child funneled into its system. This isn't law enforcement, this is exploitation. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Nathaniel let the silence hang just long enough before continuing, his voice unflinching. I have the evidence, documents, arrest records, and financial statements, and I will be presenting it to the State Attorney General's office. This ends today. A low rumble of voices rose as the crowd digested his words. Reporters shouted questions. Nathaniel raised his hand for calm. But before he could speak again, a loud voice boomed from the crowd. That's enough. Officer Daniels pushed through the sea of people, his face red with anger, his uniform a stark contrast to the swirling chaos around him. He pointed a finger at Nathaniel, his voice harsh and accusatory. You've got no right to stand up here and drag my name through the mud, Calloway, Daniels shouted. You're lying, twisting the facts. Nathaniel held his ground, his eyes steady and calm. The facts speak for themselves, Officer Daniels. I suggest you listen. You think you're untouchable? Daniels growled, stepping closer. You don't belong here. People like you come into our town and think you can tear it apart with lies. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. This isn't about me, Daniels. It's about the truth, and the truth will come out. Daniels stepped even closer, invading Nathaniel's space, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. Careful what you dig up, Calloway. People who dig too deep don't always like what they find. The crowd went silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Mitchell edged closer, his hand tightening on his notepad, ready to intervene if things turned uglier. Nathaniel didn't move, didn't blink. Is that a threat, Officer Daniels? Before Daniels could respond, a voice interrupted. That's enough, Greg. Captain Evelyn Moore emerged from the back of the crowd, her expression hard and unreadable. Daniels froze, his jaw tight as Moore pushed her way forward, placing herself between the two men. Officer Daniels, you are out of line, she said sharply. Stand down. Daniels stared at her for a long moment, his chest heaving with restrained anger. Finally, he stepped back, but his glare never left Nathaniel. This isn't over, he muttered before storming off. Captain Moore turned to Nathaniel, her voice low. Calloway, this isn't how we handle things. How we handle things? Nathaniel shot back, his voice cold. You've had years to handle it. Now it's my turn. She held his gaze for a moment, before looking away, her face lined with something that resembled guilt. Without another word, she turned and followed after Daniels, leaving Nathaniel on the steps as the reporters began shouting again. Mitchell appeared at Nathaniel's side, his voice low. That was intense. You sure this was a good idea? Nathaniel looked out at the crowd, his resolve like iron. The truth needed to come out. Let them scramble, let them know we're not backing down. That evening, as Nathaniel drove home, the weight of the day settled over him. He had stirred the hornet's nest, and he knew retaliation was coming. The system didn't like being challenged. His phone buzzed in the passenger seat. Maria. Calloway, he answered. Mr. Calloway, I just got word. There's an emergency warrant out for your arrest, Maria said, her voice tight with panic. They're saying it's obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. Nathaniel's grip on the wheel tightened. What? That's absurd. They're coming after you, sir, Maria continued. I think Daniels is behind it. You need to... Blue and red lights flared behind him, cutting her off. Nathaniel glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the squad car tailing him, sirens blaring. Maria, I have to go, he said, hanging up. He pulled to the side of the road and waited, his heart steady but his mind racing. He knew exactly what this was, a show of power, a message meant to intimidate him. The door of the squad car opened, and Officer Daniels stepped out, a smug grin plastered across his face. Another officer followed, this one younger and visibly uncomfortable. Nathaniel rolled down his window. Is there a problem, Officer Daniels? Daniels leaned down, his face inches from Nathaniel's. You're under arrest, Calloway. Step out of the car. Nathaniel's blood boiled, but he stayed calm. On what grounds? Obstruction of justice. You know exactly what you did. Daniels grinned, clearly enjoying the moment. Step out now. Nathaniel exhaled slowly and complied, opening the door and stepping onto the gravel shoulder. The younger officer fumbled with the cuffs, clearly uneasy. Daniels snatched them from his hands and roughly yanked Nathaniel's arms behind his back. "This is a mistake," Nathaniel said, his voice low but steady. "You're making this worse for yourself." Daniels ignored him, snapping the cuffs tighter than necessary. "We'll see about that." As Nathaniel was led toward the squad car, Daniels leaned in close, his voice a whisper meant just for him. "You want to play hero, Calloway? Let's see how long you last." Nathaniel didn't respond. He kept his head high as Daniels shoved him into the back seat, the door slamming shut with finality. Through the window, Nathaniel watched the night sky stretch above him, cold and endless. They thought this would break him. They were wrong. The cliffhanger. Back at the police station, Daniels paraded Nathaniel through the front lobby like a trophy. Officers stopped and stared, some whispering while others looked away uncomfortably. Daniels shoved Nathaniel into a holding cell, locking the door with an echoing clang. "You sit tight, Calloway," Daniels sneered. "It's gonna be a long night." As Daniels disappeared down the hall, Nathaniel sat on the cold metal bench, his hands still cuffed in front of him. His mind was sharp, his anger controlled. They wanted him humiliated, defeated. Instead, they had given him exactly what he needed. Proof. Maria would alert Mitchell. The arrest itself, the absurd charges, they were all part of the story now. Daniels had overplayed his hand, and Nathaniel would make sure the entire town saw it. He leaned back against the wall, his gaze steady as he stared at the cell bars. "They think this is the end," he thought. "This is just the beginning." Nathaniel Calloway sat in the holding cell, the flickering fluorescent light above him casting sharp shadows on the cold concrete floor. His wrists ached where the cuffs had bitten into his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was a storm of thoughts and strategies. "They thought this would break me." He let the words repeat in his head like a mantra. Daniel's smug face flashed in his mind, but Nathaniel steeled himself. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The metal door creaked open, and Officer Greg Daniels entered, his boots echoing off the walls with deliberate slowness. He carried an air of self-satisfied authority, a predator savoring his moment of triumph. "Well, Calloway," Daniels sneered, leaning against the bars. "Look at you now. All that talk about justice, and here you are behind bars, where you belong." Nathaniel raised his head, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Enjoy this while it lasts, Daniels. Because when this is over, you'll be the one looking at steel bars." Daniels laughed, a low, cruel sound that bounced off the walls. "Oh, is that so? You think anyone's going to believe you? You're the outsider here, Calloway. You don't know how things work in Millbrook. I do." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "You think you're untouchable, that no one sees what you're doing. But you're wrong. People are watching. People who matter. The evidence I have. It's already out there. You've built your empire on fear, Daniels, and it's crumbling." Daniels' smirk faltered just slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. "What evidence? You're bluffing." Nathaniel allowed himself a thin, knowing smile. "You arrested me under bogus charges. That's mistake number one. You made it public. That's mistake number two. Maria and Mitchell are already running the story. Every name, every kickback, every innocent kid you locked up for profit by morning. The Attorney General will have everything they need to bring you down." Daniel's expression darkened, the blood draining from his face. For the first time, Nathaniel saw a crack in the man's armor, a sliver of fear where arrogance had once stood. "You're lying!" Daniels hissed, but the edge in his voice betrayed him. "Try me," Nathaniel shot back, his voice ice cold. "Do you think this ends here? You think you can intimidate me into silence? No, Daniels. I've fought men like you my entire life. You don't scare me, and you never will." Daniel's hands curled into fists at his sides, his composure slipping. "You don't know what you're doing, Calloway. You push too hard, and you'll regret it. People like me. We run this town." Nathaniel stood slowly, his full height a deliberate reminder that he was not a man to be cornered. He stepped toward the bars, his voice low and clear. "People like you have been running this town for far too long, but you're done. Your time is up." Daniel stepped back, his face twisting into something ugly, a mix of rage and panic. The silence between them was thick, the air electric with tension. Before Daniels could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. The door swung open, and Captain Evelyn Moore entered, her face tight and unreadable. Behind her trailed Mitchell Ford, holding a folder under one arm, and Maria, her face pale but resolute. "What's going on here?" Moore demanded, her voice sharp as she took in the scene. Daniels standing too close to Nathaniel's cell, his body taut with barely restrained anger. Daniels turned on her, his voice rising. "Captain, he's lying. He's spreading garbage about me, trying to ruin my career." Moore ignored him, her gaze shifting to Nathaniel. "Calloway, are you all right?" Nathaniel nodded, his expression calm. "I'm fine, Captain, but Daniels here has a lot to answer for." Daniels whipped around to Moore, his voice desperate. "You're not seriously listening to this. This outsider, he's trying to destroy everything we've built." Moore's face remained impassive, but her voice held an edge of steel. "I think you're the one destroying it, Greg." Daniels froze. "What?" She turned to Mitchell Ford, who handed her the folder he'd been holding. Moore opened it, her face hardening as she scanned the pages. "These are arrest records, Daniels' dozens of cases. Teenagers charged with minor offenses, processed without proper evidence, all connected to Brookhaven Youth Facility. There's financial documentation linking you directly to kickbacks from the facility." Daniel's face turned a shade paler. That's not real. He planted that evidence." Nathaniel stepped closer to the bars, his voice cutting through the chaos. "This isn't just about you, Daniels. It's about the system you're a part of. The one that profits off innocent lives. You think you're just one man protecting his little corner of power? No, you're a symptom of something rotten." Moore stepped toward Daniels, her expression cold and resolute. "Greg, as of this moment, you're suspended pending further investigation." "You can't do this!" Daniels shouted, his voice cracking. He stepped toward Moore, his posture aggressive, but two other officers appeared in the doorway, their hands resting on their holsters in silent warning. Moore didn't flinch. "Hand over your badge, Daniels, now." For a moment, Daniels looked ready to fight. His eyes darted from Moore to the officers behind her, and then to Nathaniel, who stood in the cell, watching him with calm, unrelenting defiance. Finally, with a strangled growl, Daniels ripped the badge from his chest and threw it to the ground. "You're all making a mistake," he spat. "This town needs me." "No, Daniels," Nathaniel said quietly. "This town needs justice." The tide turns. Within minutes, Nathaniel was released from the cell, his wrists freed from the biting metal cuffs. Maria rushed to his side, her face etched with concern. "Are you okay?" Nathaniel nodded, though the tension hadn't fully left his body. "I'm fine, Maria. You did good, both of you." He glanced at Mitchell, who managed a tight smile. "Hell of a story, Calloway," Mitchell said. "But it's far from over. Daniels isn't the only one who'll need to answer for this." Nathaniel turned, watching through the station window as Daniels was escorted out of the building, his face flushed with humiliation. A small crowd had gathered outside, reporters shouting questions and cameras flashing. The story was spreading. Nathaniel knew this was just the beginning. Daniels was a symptom, but the system itself was still alive and well. Brookhaven Youth Facility, the judges who looked the other way, the officers who turned arrests into paychecks. It all needed to come crashing down. Captain Moore approached him, her expression softer now. "You're going to keep pushing this, aren't you?" Nathaniel met her gaze. "You know I am." Moore sighed, though there was something like respect in her eyes. "Then let's make it count. I'll back your investigation. I can't change the past, but I can help fix what's broken." Nathaniel extended his hand, and after a moment, Moore took it. "Thank you, Captain." As he stepped outside into the cool night air, Nathaniel felt the weight on his shoulders lessen. Just a fraction. Daniels was exposed, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Maria fell into step beside him. "What's next?" Nathaniel's eyes narrowed, his voice resolute. "We take this all the way to Brookhaven. No more secrets, no more silence." The cameras turned toward him as he walked through the crowd, the flashes bright against the darkened sky. This was what Daniels and men like him had feared all along. The light of truth, burning too brightly to ignore. Nathaniel stopped for a moment, looking out over the faces in the crowd. Mothers, fathers, teenagers, who had come to see what justice looked like. His voice was calm, but firm as he spoke. This is just the beginning. The courtroom was packed. Word of Nathaniel Calloway's allegations against Officer Greg Daniels and the Brookhaven Youth Facility had spread like wildfire. Local reporters crowded the aisles, cameras stationed near the back, their lenses focused on the man who dared to challenge the system. Town residents whispered anxiously in the gallery, their eyes shifting between Nathaniel, standing tall at the defense table, and Officer Daniels, seated on the prosecution's side with his lawyer, a smug, suited man who looked as though he'd been summoned to make trouble vanish. Judge Garrison sat stiffly on the bench, his face stone cold as he called for silence. His gavel struck once. Twice. "Order in the court," he barked. The chatter quieted immediately. Nathaniel took a deep breath, steadying himself. This moment wasn't just about clearing Jeremy Daniels' name or holding Officer Daniels accountable. This was about dismantling a system of corruption that had taken root in Millbrook for far too long. The weight of generations of injustice hung heavy in the air, but Nathaniel stood firm, his resolve like iron. "Mr. Calloway," Judge Garrison said, his voice slow and deliberate, "you have made serious claims against a respected officer of this community. I trust you have evidence to back these allegations." Nathaniel rose, smoothing the front of his dark suit. His voice was clear, calm, and unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." He turned toward the courtroom as the lights dimmed. Maria, seated near the front, connected a laptop to the projector. The screen above the judge flickered to life, displaying the evidence Nathaniel had spent days gathering: arrest records, financial transfers, and confidential memos implicating not just Officer Daniels, but several others in a pipeline of exploitation. "This," Nathaniel began, gesturing to the screen, "is just the beginning." The courtroom stilled as the first document appeared. A series of neatly typed arrest records, the names of young black teenagers circled in red. Nathaniel stepped closer to the jury box, his tone deliberate. "Over the past year, Officer Greg Daniels has arrested over a dozen minors, boys and girls, for petty offenses. Many of these cases were dismissed due to lack of evidence, yet every single one of these children was taken to Brookhaven Youth Facility, a privately owned detention center." He paused, letting the room absorb his words. The jury members shifted uncomfortably. And why? Because for each child processed at Brookhaven, kickbacks were funneled to Daniels and others within this system. Kids, innocent kids, became revenue streams. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Daniels' lawyer sprang to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These claims are outrageous." Nathaniel turned sharply, unshaken. "Outrageous because they're true." He tapped the laptop, and a new screen appeared. Financial records, payments traced back to Officer Daniels' accounts, subtle but undeniable. "Here are the bank transfers," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "Funds routed from Brookhaven to Daniels' accounts in increments of $2,000 for every processed offense. These aren't fabricated, Your Honor. These are bank records, subpoenaed and verified." The room exploded into murmurs, reporters scribbling notes furiously. Judge Garrison pounded his gavel. "Order!" Nathaniel pressed forward, his voice rising just enough to command attention. "This isn't about one bad cop. This is about a system designed to profit from injustice, a system that targeted vulnerable children, labeled them criminals, and destroyed their futures to line the pockets of those in power." He turned then, his gaze landing on Daniels, who sat rigid, his face pale and furious. "Officer Daniels," Nathaniel said, his tone sharp but calm, "would you like to explain these transfers to the court?" Daniels shot up from his seat, his fists slamming onto the table. "This is a damn witch hunt," he snarled, his voice echoing across the courtroom. "I've done nothing wrong." Nathaniel didn't blink. "You've done everything wrong. You targeted Jeremy Daniels and dozens of others because you assumed no one would stand up to you. But here we are." Daniels' lawyer tugged at his arm, whispering frantically, but Daniels ignored him. "You think you're some kind of hero, Calloway? You don't know how things work in this town." Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "What I know, Daniels, is that your time is up." Daniels sneered, his anger boiling over. "You don't belong here," he shouted, the mask slipping from his face completely. "People like you come here thinking you can fix everything, tear it all apart, but this town isn't yours." There it was, the truth stripped bare, his prejudice and corruption on full display. Nathaniel turned to the jury, gesturing toward Daniels. This is the man entrusted to serve and protect your community. This is what happens when power goes unchecked. Daniels sank back into his chair, his lawyer finally pulling him into a tense whisper. But the damage had been done. The jury's faces reflected a mix of disgust and disbelief, the room's energy shifting like a tide. Nathaniel returned to the defense table, letting the silence sit for a moment before speaking again. Your Honor, I rest my case. Judge Garrison's face was unreadable as he stared down at Nathaniel. The weight of the moment pressed on everyone in the room as the gavel finally came down. This court will recess for deliberation. The tension. Outside. Nathaniel stepped outside the courthouse, the cool afternoon air hitting him like a wave. A crowd had gathered. Reporters with microphones, community members with signs demanding justice, and Jeremy's mother standing anxiously near the steps. Maria and Mitchell joined him as he descended, their faces taut with anticipation. You think it's enough? Mitchell asked, his voice low. Nathaniel exhaled, his eyes scanning the crowd. The truth is on our side, but whether it's enough? He let the words hang, the uncertainty heavy. Maria touched his arm. No matter what happens, you did the right thing, Mr. Calloway. Nathaniel nodded, but said nothing. His eyes locked onto Officer Daniels, who had exited the courthouse under heavy scrutiny, his face twisted in anger as reporters swarmed him. Daniels' gaze met Nathaniel's, and for a brief moment, the hatred was almost palpable. You think this is over? Daniels hissed, his voice carrying across the steps. Nathaniel didn't flinch, he simply said, It's over for you. Daniels was pulled away by his lawyer, disappearing into the crowd as reporters snapped photos. Nathaniel turned back toward the people gathered, mothers holding their children close, teenagers looking on with cautious hope, and men and women who had suffered under the same system Daniels had thrived in. Mr. Calloway, a reporter called, thrusting a microphone toward him. What happens now? Nathaniel's gaze swept over the crowd, his voice calm but strong. Now, we wait. But no matter what the jury decides, this fight isn't over. Corruption only thrives when we look away. Today, we chose to look it in the eye. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Nathaniel felt the tension still simmering beneath the surface. This is just the beginning, he thought. The uncertainty. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, Nathaniel stood alone near the courthouse steps, his hands in his pockets. The crowd had begun to thin, the reporters heading back to their newsrooms, the families retreating home. Maria approached quietly. The jury still deliberating could take hours. Nathaniel nodded, his jaw tight. I know. You okay? He turned to look at her, his eyes reflecting a mix of exhaustion and resolve. I'm not stopping, Maria, no matter how this ends. She smiled softly. I didn't expect you would. Nathaniel looked back at the courthouse, its imposing silhouette cast against the dimming sky. Inside, the fate of Daniels, and perhaps the first step toward dismantling Millbrook's corruption, was being decided. His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it, his eyes fixed on the doors. The outcome would change everything, and as the last of the sunlight disappeared, Nathaniel whispered to himself, Whatever happens, we're ready. The courthouse doors swung open. A hush fell over the crowd as everyone turned to face the jury foreman. A tall man with graying hair and weary eyes, Nathaniel Calloway, stood on the steps, his shoulders squared and his gaze steady. Jeremy Daniels and his mother stood close by, their hands tightly clasped together, bracing for whatever came next. The foreman cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the room. In the matter of the state of Millbrook versus Officer Greg Daniels, we find the defendant guilty of abuse of power, falsifying evidence, and conspiracy for financial gain. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled for their microphones, townsfolk gasped, and a ripple of murmurs broke out like a wave. At the defense table, Greg Daniels froze, his face a mask of disbelief. He opened his mouth to protest, but Judge Garrison's sharp rap of the gavel silenced him. "Order in the court!" the judge barked, though even his voice trembled under the weight of what had just happened. Nathaniel let out a slow breath, a tide of relief washing over him. It was not just a verdict, it was a moment of reckoning, a first blow against a corrupted system. He turned to Jeremy, whose wide, stunned eyes darted up to meet his own. "We won?" Jeremy whispered, his voice almost too small to hear. Nathaniel placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, his smile warm. "We won." Tears streamed down Miss Daniel's face as she hugged her son, whispering soft words of love and relief. Nathaniel stepped back, watching the moment unfold. This wasn't just about Jeremy. It was about every child whose voice had been silenced, every family torn apart. Daniel's fall. Officer Greg Daniels was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his face flushed with anger and shame. The smug arrogance he had worn like a badge of honor was gone, replaced by hollow fury. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions as cameras flashed. "Officer Daniels, any comment? Do you regret your actions? Are there others involved in the corruption?" Daniels kept his head down, his silence offering the answers everyone already knew. He was the first to fall, but Nathaniel knew he wouldn't be the last. Daniels' guilt would pull others into the light, officials, judges, and private contractors who had exploited the system for profit. It was a house of cards, and the first card had just been yanked free. As Daniels was loaded into the waiting squad car, Captain Evelyn Moore stood at the courthouse steps, addressing the press. Her voice was firm, her shoulders squared, but her eyes betrayed the weight of what had been revealed. "This department failed the people it was meant to serve," she admitted. "Greg Daniels acted with impunity for far too long, but today, accountability has begun. We are launching a full internal investigation, and I assure you that justice will be served." Nathaniel watched from a distance, Maria standing beside him. "You think she means it?" she asked softly. "She doesn't have a choice now," Nathaniel replied. "The world is watching." The community rises. In the days that followed, Millbrook buzzed with change. The story of Greg Daniels' corruption and Nathaniel's fight for justice had spread beyond the small-town regional and national news outlets, ran headlines that painted Millbrook as both a symbol of systemic failure and of hope. Millbrook's reckoning, corrupt system exposed. Lawyer Nathaniel Calloway sparks change in small town. Brookhaven Youth Facility under investigation for profit scheme. Town hall meetings began drawing crowds like never before. Parents demanded answers. Local activists formed coalitions. For the first time in decades, people were no longer afraid to speak out. They came with stories, names, and evidence. Nathaniel was invited to speak at the first community forum. The small auditorium overflowed with residents, mothers, fathers, teenagers, and elders, all eager for answers and justice. Standing at the podium, Nathaniel's deep voice carried through the room. "This isn't just about one man or one case. It's about a system that failed us, that profited from our pain. But today, you proved that change is possible, that when we stand together, no corruption can withstand the truth." The crowd erupted into applause. The energy-electric Nathaniel caught Jeremy's eye in the front row. The boy now sitting taller, his shoulders no longer weighed down by fear. He smiled faintly, a small but powerful reminder of why Nathaniel had fought so hard. Nathaniel's growth. Later that night, Nathaniel sat on the porch of his modest home, his tie loosened, his hands wrapped around a mug of cooling coffee. The stars were out, their light faint but steady, a comforting sight after weeks of chaos. Maria sat in the rocking chair beside him, scrolling through her phone. "You're a hero, you know that?" she said quietly, breaking the silence. Nathaniel smiled, shaking his head. "I'm not a hero, I'm just doing what needs to be done." She looked at him, her brow furrowed. "But it didn't have to be you, Nathaniel. You could have walked away. This town wasn't your responsibility." He turned his gaze to the darkened street, his voice soft but firm. "Every town like Millbrook is my responsibility. I've seen too many people crushed by systems that weren't made for them. Kids like Jeremy, families like his mother's. If I don't fight for them, who will?" Maria nodded, understanding. "So, what's next?" Nathaniel took a deep breath, the night air cool in his lungs. "Brookhaven isn't done. We've cracked the surface. But there's more underneath, more people who need to answer for what they've done, and I'm going to make sure they do." Systemic change. Within weeks, Brookhaven Youth Facility was shut down, its administrators facing criminal charges for their role in the scheme. The fallout spread across the state, reaching politicians and corporate leaders who had turned a blind eye for too long. Investigations uncovered similar operations in neighboring counties, sparking widespread reform initiatives. The police department in Millbrook underwent a complete overhaul. Officers were retrained, new leadership was installed, and oversight committees, comprised of community members, were created to ensure accountability. Captain Moore became a reluctant ally, working alongside Nathaniel to rebuild trust in the department. For Jeremy Daniels, life began to stabilize. Nathaniel stayed in touch with him and his mother, helping them secure scholarships and counseling. Jeremy even started speaking at youth forums, his voice a beacon for others who had felt voiceless. A promise for the future. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Nathaniel found himself at the park where the town had gathered for a community celebration. Kids ran across the grass, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Jeremy and his friends were among them, playing basketball on a newly refurbished court. Nathaniel stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. It wasn't perfect, there was still work to be done, and the scars of what had happened would take time to heal. But for now, there was hope. Maria joined him, her sunglasses perched atop her head. "It's a good day," she said with a smile. Nathaniel nodded, his expression softening. "It is." Jeremy jogged over, a basketball tucked under his arm. "Mr. Calloway," he called out, a grin lighting up his face. "We need another player, you in?" Nathaniel chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't want me slowing you down?" "Come on," Jeremy insisted, his voice full of energy. "You're not getting out of this." Nathaniel smiled, loosening his tie as he followed the boy to the court. As he dribbled the ball, surrounded by kids who had been given another chance, he realized something. This was why he fought. Not for headlines or applause, but for moments like this, for kids who could finally just be kids without fear. As the game began, Nathaniel's voice echoed across the court. "All right, let's see what you've got." The fight wasn't over. There were more towns, more systems, more battles waiting. But for today, Nathaniel Calloway had won. And that was enough. The sun hung low over Millbrook, painting the town in soft golds and deep oranges, as if signaling the end of an era and the beginning of something new. Nathaniel Calloway sat quietly on a bench in the park, a notebook resting on his lap around him. Life carried on. Kids played on the basketball court, laughter echoing into the evening. Families gathered for picnics, their voices warm and unburdened. It was a simple scene, yet for Nathaniel, it held profound significance. It hadn't been easy. Nothing about the fight for justice ever was. Greg Daniels' conviction marked a turning point, but Nathaniel knew it was only the first step in dismantling a corrupt system that had existed for years. Brookhaven Youth Facility was shut down, its administrators exposed and brought to justice. Investigations rippled across the state, pulling others into the light, judges, officers, and politicians who had quietly profited from the pain of others. What started as a single case in Millbrook became a movement that refused to be ignored. For Nathaniel, the victory was bittersweet. He had seen progress, but he also knew the wounds left behind wouldn't heal overnight. Jeremy Daniels and the other children who had been unfairly targeted were left with scars, some visible, others buried deeper. The system had robbed them of their innocence, but it hadn't broken them. Jeremy's smile, his laughter on the court, was proof of that. Nathaniel scribbled a note in his journal, a habit he'd picked up during the long nights when sleep was elusive. "Justice isn't an end point. It's a road we walk every day, one step forward, one truth revealed, one voice lifted above the silence." The notebook was filled with similar reflections, reminders of why he fought, why he would keep fighting. He knew his work wasn't done, not here and certainly not anywhere else. Millbrook was just one town in a country full of systems that needed to be challenged, truths that needed to be told. The cost of change. The journey had changed him. He'd always been resilient, a lawyer who knew how to hold his ground in the courtroom, a man who could wield the truth like a weapon. But Millbrook tested him in ways he hadn't expected. It was one thing to fight for justice in a system you believed in. It was another to stand alone in a town that saw you as an outsider. Nathaniel had faced suspicion, anger, and threats, but he refused to waver. Every moment of doubt, every sneer from Greg Daniels, only strengthened his resolve. He thought back to the confrontation in the courthouse, the moment Daniel's mask slipped and his corruption was laid bare. It wasn't just about power for Daniels, it was about control, about maintaining a system that kept people like Nathaniel and Jeremy on the margins. Daniels's words still echoed in Nathaniel's mind. "You don't belong here." It was a sentiment Nathaniel had heard his whole life, spoken in whispers and unspoken in actions. But Millbrook proved something he had always believed: that belonging wasn't something you waited for, it was something you claimed. And by standing up for Jeremy Daniels, by exposing the truth, Nathaniel had claimed his place, not just in Millbrook, but in a larger story of justice and accountability. Nathaniel smiled faintly as he watched Jeremy on the court, dribbling the ball and calling for a pass. The boy had a lightness to him now, a freedom Nathaniel hadn't seen before. It was a reminder that the fight wasn't just about tearing down what was broken, it was about building something better. A spark of change. The town was different now. The story of Millbrook spread far beyond its borders, shining a spotlight on the ways systemic injustice thrived in silence. Local leaders were replaced, oversight committees formed, and policies rewritten to prioritize accountability and fairness. Captain Evelyn Moore, though initially reluctant, had become an ally under her leadership. The police department was rebuilt, its ranks filled with officers who understood that protecting the community meant serving it with compassion and integrity. Community meetings became a fixture in Millbrook, drawing people who had once felt voiceless. Mothers stood at podiums, sharing stories of their children. Young men and women stepped forward, demanding change. What began as a fight led by Nathaniel grew into something much larger, something shared. One evening, at a packed town hall meeting, Nathaniel listened as Jeremy spoke into the microphone, his voice clear and steady. "What happened to me wasn't right," Jeremy said, his words carrying through the room. "But I'm not scared anymore, and I'm not going to let it happen to anyone else." The crowd erupted into applause, and Nathaniel felt a swell of pride. Jeremy's transformation was the embodiment of everything Nathaniel had fought for. A young man who refused to be defined by the injustices he had faced. Nathaniel's next step. As the stars emerged that evening, Nathaniel closed his notebook and leaned back against the bench. Maria, who had been by his side through it all, sat beside him with a coffee in hand. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "you could open a bigger firm here. People trust you now, they'd follow you." Nathaniel smiled, his gaze drifting toward the court where the kids were still playing under the glow of the streetlights. "I've thought about it," he admitted, "but Millbrook doesn't need me anymore. They've found their voice." Maria nodded, though she looked at him curiously. "So, what now? Where do you go next?" Nathaniel exhaled, his voice calm but resolute. "There are more towns like this, more kids like Jeremy. I'll keep fighting. Wherever I'm needed, I'll be there." Maria smiled softly. "You really don't stop, do you?" Nathaniel chuckled, shaking his head. "Not until I have to." A call to action. Nathaniel's story wasn't about one victory, one town, or one corrupt officer. It was about the power of truth and the courage to stand up when no one else would. Millbrook became a symbol, a reminder that no matter how deeply injustice was rooted, it could be pulled from the ground. But it took people willing to speak up, to take risks, and to refuse to look away. As the night deepened, Nathaniel thought about the people who had inspired him: activists, lawyers, parents who had fought similar battles long before him. Their legacy lived on in every step he took, and he knew his fight was part of something much larger. To anyone who listened, his message was clear: injustice thrives in silence, but silence is a choice. Speak up, fight back, and demand better. No change comes without struggle, but every step forward matters. The last scene. Before leaving the park, Nathaniel took a moment to watch the game. One last time Jeremy ran across the court, his laughter bright and unburdened. For a moment, Nathaniel allowed himself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. "Mr. Calloway," Jeremy called, waving from across the court. "You're coming back, right?" Nathaniel smiled, slipping his notebook into his pocket. "You'll see me again," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. "You can count on it." He turned and walked into the night, his silhouette fading into the glow of the streetlights behind him, the sound of bouncing basketballs and children's laughter carried into the air. A small, beautiful victory. The road ahead was long, and the fight was far from over. But for Nathaniel Calloway, there was no turning back. Tomorrow would bring another town, another courtroom, and another chance to make a difference. And he was ready.